Released on Mute Records in 1995, Everything Is Wrong is probably remembered more today for its sleeve notes, a rambling essay during which Moby explained how everything was wrong.
When I was 16, 17 years old, I was very active in the sort of hardcore punk scene, and a lot of times you'd buy hardcore records, hardcore punk records, and they would have essays on them, you know, and this was the early 80s, so the essays would be about, you know, how bad consumer culture was and how awful Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were. And they were all naive essays, but they were, you know, seemed like a nice vehicle for communication. And when I was signed to Instinct Records, they wouldn't let me put essays on my records. But then suddenly I was signed to Mute Records, and Daniel Miller, the owner of Mute, actually encouraged me to sort of express my beliefs through the work that I do. So that's why Everything Is Wrong was sort of, you know, filled with essays and quotes. I think a lot of people, A, were confused by the record, because it was a very eclectic record, and B, they were kind of confused and surprised that here's someone who came from the world of dance music who had a social conscience and who was, you know, addressing certain political issues. And some people loved the fact that I was outspoken politically and socially, and some people thought it was absurd. You know, if someone likes what I do, I read the reviews, and if someone doesn't like what I do, I try and ignore it. And I know that might be bad, but I don't see the point in getting depressed about a bad review because there's nothing I can do to change it. Unless a bad review is really well put together, like if it's very cogent, then sure, I'll pay attention to it. But a lot of times bad reviews just reflect the idiosyncratic biases of the journalist, and they really don't necessarily tell me anything about the work that I'm doing.
For his next album, 1996's Animal Rights, Moby seemed to reject dance music completely, releasing what verged on a heavy metal record. Confused? Well, you were supposed to be.
A lot of my musical heroes are people that experimented with different types of music, and it seemed like it used to be kind of acceptable. I mean, I think of the Beatles, and, you know, compare I Want to Hold Your Hand to Revolution Number 9. You know, compare Glass Onion to Magical Mystery Tour. You know, it's like, sonically they experimented with so many different things, and at some point in the 80s or the 90s, people started to expect musicians to just make one type of music for their entire career. And I think that's so unhealthy and so limiting and so boring at the end of the day. There's so many wonderful different types of music in the world, why not experiment with them? So when I made Animal Rights, that was just the record I wanted to make. I wanted to make a sort of visceral, aggressive record. And luckily I'm signed to a record company that let me do it. One of the nice things about being a musician is it's my prerogative to make whatever type of music I want. And that might sound selfish, but I think any sort of, you know, creative output is kind of inherently selfish. And, I mean, you can still serve a purpose through the work that you do, but I'd certainly rather make records that surprise and shock people than records that bore people into complacency.
Some people go to church just to signify, trying to make a date with a neighbor's wife. Brother, let me tell you, just as sure as you're born, you better leave that woman alone. Go tell that lonesome liar, go tell that midnight rider, tell the gambling, rambling, backslider, tell the barman, go cruise down, run on for a long time, run on, dust when it's dark, run on you for a long time. Let me tell you, God Almighty gonna cut you down. You might run on for a long time, run on, dust when it's dark, run on you for a long time. Let me tell you, God Almighty gonna cut you down. You might run on for a long time, run on, dust when it's dark, run on you for a long time. Let me tell you, God Almighty gonna cut you down. You might run on for a long time, run on, dust when it's dark, run on you for a long time.
I Like to Score in 1997 marked a move back towards dance music. But even when Play was recorded, Moby's continuance in music wasn't assured, and a potential move back to the world of steady employment seemed possible.
When I make a record, I'm alone in my studio for a long time. And, you know, I write the songs in my studio, and I play the instruments, and I do the engineering and the production, and there's really no one else involved. So I lose perspective very, very quickly. And my only agenda in making a record is I want to make a nice record. That's all I care about. And using these old vocals, I really didn't care whether they were old or whether they were new, whether they came from America or whether they came from Canada, whether they came from Japan. I don't really care about the original context of where these vocals came from. I mean, I'm interested in it, but That's not why I use them. The reason I use them is because they're beautiful, wonderful musical performances. They could have been recorded 10 minutes ago, they could have been recorded 100 years ago. That doesn't really matter to me. It's just what matters to me is the universal human emotional quality that they have.
The vocals in Play often consist of historical recordings of old black communities singing gospel and soul songs. Dance music can be accused of lacking soul. These vocals can't.
The old vocals that I used on Play, I discovered them by accident. I was out to dinner with a friend of mine and he gave me some CDs that had these old vocal recordings on them, and I just fell in love with them. And the nice thing is they were really well recorded and they had a really beautiful quality to them, so I sampled them and basically wrote new songs based around these old vocals. I use a lot of different criteria to judge the records I make. I judge them from a songwriting perspective, from a musician's perspective, from an engineer's perspective, and from a producer's perspective. So I can listen to certain songs that I've made and think that they're awful just because I don't like the way the kick drum sounds. You know, it could be a great song, but the engineer part of me says, oh, the kick drum sounds bad, therefore the song is a failure. So when I finished Play, I lost perspective. And I didn't know if it was a good record, I didn't know if it was a bad record, I didn't know if it was an average record. When I finished it, I really had no idea at all. We got some good reviews and some average reviews, 1 or 2 bad reviews, and that seemed normal. And it was selling pretty well. You know, I think in the first 6 months it was out, we sold about, I don't know, 400,000, 500,000 copies worldwide. And I was amazed. I was like, wow, great, we've sold 500,000 copies worldwide. That's phenomenal. That's so much more than I ever expected. And now we're up to almost 5 million copies worldwide, and it's been #1 in 5 or 6 different countries and platinum in 16 different countries. So much more than I ever expected. I mean, I really thought that the fate of Play was going to be the fate of a lot of sort of interesting records. It would come out, get a few good reviews, I'd play a few concerts, and then the record would go away. I never expected it to have the sort of life that it's had. If Play had been an unsuccessful record, you know, there's a good chance I wouldn't have had a record contract anymore. And there's a good chance I would have been relegated to that tier of musicians who at one point had a little success and then went on to be, you know, I hate to use the expression, but sort of has-beens, at least from a public perspective. It's hard when you make records and when you're a public figure, to some extent, you do base your perception of yourself on the way you're perceived in the media and as a public figure. I wish that weren't the case. You know, I wish my self-esteem came from me, and I wish my sense of self came exclusively from me, but no, if I have a successful record, it makes me feel better about myself. And if I have, you know, if I play a concert and people like me, it makes me feel better about myself. And that's dangerous in the long run, but at the same time, maybe it spurs me on to make better records. You know, if I was complacent, if I was self-satisfied, I don't know if I'd work as hard making the music that I do.